Xu Chu and Dian Wei were Cao Cao's powerful bodyguards who wielded great physical strength. Dian Wei died defending his lord, but Xu Chu lived on to become a general of Wei and lived until the reign of Cao Rui. Xu Chu is described as a big and strong man, but because he was simple-minded and honest, his troops nicknamed him Tiger Fool. His posthumous title literally means Robust Marquis. Dian Wei's weapons of choice were spears, halberds, or long swords. He excelled at wielding a pair of halberds, each said to weigh 20 kilograms each. He is sometimes compared to Eli, an ancient bodyguard who was also known for his immense physical strength. Xu Chu was from Qiao County, Pei State. He had an imposing and sturdy look, with a height of around 6'1" and with a broad waist. Dian Wei was from Jiwu County, Chenliu, and is described as a stalwart man with great strength. In his youth, Dian Wei had the ambition of becoming a Yuxia, a vigilante. Xu Chu, on the other hand, became a famous brave local as he rallied thousands of his clan members to fight the Yellow Turbans. They constructed a fortress for safe garrison against an army from Runan until eventually over 10,000 turbans had gathered. The outnumbered defenders were worn out from all the fighting, so Xu Chu sent the most weary to assist the archers until all the arrows ran out. When this happened, he tasked the women and children to gather stones and to place them in the four corners of the fort. Xu Chu resorted to hurling stones and rocks at his enemy, but did so with astounding lethality. It said he crushed the bones of all those who were hit. The rebels refused to go near the fort after this, so they surrounded it until the food ran out instead. Xu Chu negotiated a truce with a trade deal, 1 ox for some food supplies, but when the rebels came to collect the ox, the animal would always run back towards the fort. During this fuss, Xu Chu held on to the animal's tail and pulled it for more than 100 steps until it collapsed. Seeing this, the startled rebels took off without the ox, and the people in the surrounding areas became fearful of Xu Chu's strength. When Dian Wei was young, he accepted a job to help a certain Liu family in Xiangyi County exact revenge against a former county chief. As the target was always well protected by his bodyguards on his travels, Dian Wei disguised himself as a marquis instead and travelled to his house in a carriage bearing gifts. He entered the house without a challenge and stabbed the former chief and his wife with a hidden dagger. He got out of the house, retrieved his sword and spear from his carriage, and then left the scene on foot. News of the murder quickly spread to the nearby marketplace, and the whole town was shocked. Hundreds of men gathered to go after the murderer, and initially none of them actually approached Dian Wei. After walking 4 to 5 miles on foot, Dian Wei saw his companions, which is when a brief fight broke out with the pursuers. Dian Wei was able to escape, and after this incident he was known as either a hero or villain by many locals. Cao Cao and Zhang Miao were some of the first to take up arms against Dongzhuo in 190. Dian Wei answered the call to arms and joined up with Zhang Miao, becoming a subordinate under Zhao Chong. Once, a large banner was blowing in the strong wind, and many men couldn't stop it from swaying despite their combined efforts. Dian Wei grabbed the banner pole with only one hand and then kept it upright, and Zhao Chong was shocked by his strength. During the campaign, Dian Wei became a subordinate of Xie Hadun's, and he was later promoted to a major for his courage in battle. During the Battle of Yan province, after Cao Cao had returned to the region, he launched a surprise night attack just west of Puyang. Lu Bu's camps were destroyed before dawn, so Cao Cao had his troops make preparations to return to their base. Out of nowhere, Lu Bu caught them in an onrush, and he had personally led his troops to attack Cao Cao. Dian Wei rallied dozens of men to gather around him. He ordered them to put on 2 layers of armour each, throw away their shields, and to only use spears or halberds. As they braced for impact, a second contingent of men fired arrows upon them from the west, but Dian Wei, armoured up, remained oblivious to the barrage and told his men, "Let me know when the enemy is 10 paces away. Tell me when the enemy is 5 paces away." His men did as they were instructed, and let out clashing cries of fear when the units collided. Dian Wei was stood next to a pile of spears and halberds, and threw them one by one at his enemy. It said that each one knocked down an enemy soldier, and not a single one missed its target. The two sides fought until the sun rose, then Lu Bu and Cao Cao retreated to their camps. When the fighting was over, Cao was impressed with the performance from the robustly built fighter who stood before him. He promoted Dian Wei to be the commander over his hundreds of bodyguards that patrolled his tent. Dian personally selected who would serve in his unit whenever they went into battle, and this unit was always the first one to charge the enemy formation. Dian Wei became known in the army for his loyalty, deep concern for the future, and his responsibilities as a whole. There was a saying in the camp, "Dian Wei resides here, in our camp, the warrior who wields a pair of Jis weighing 80 jin." He often stood guard outside Cao's tent from morning until dusk, and always slept next to it. He rarely returned to his own personal quarters, and he had an enormous appetite. Even his huge mouthfuls and the long gulps he took from drinking are noteworthy. Several men were needed just to serve him whenever he sat for meals, and Cao was ever impressed by him. In early 197, Cao Cao invaded Jiangsu at Wancheng. When they approached, Jiangsu came out to surrender, which greatly pleased Cao, so a banquet was held to honour the peace deal. Dian Wei stood guard behind Cao Cao during the party, holding a giant battle axe with a long blade. Not one of Jiangsu's men dared to look up when they toasted to Cao. After 10 days had passed, Jiangsu then suddenly rebelled and launched a surprise attack on the camp. Cao was caught unprepared, so he retreated with only a few horsemen. Dian Wei only had about 12 men with him, so their position was heavily outnumbered. He stood guard at one of the entrances to his master's camp to block the enemies from pursuing. They scattered in all directions and broke into the camp from the other gates, but Dian Wei fought against those in front of him bravely. It's said that with each swing of his long halberd, he broke more than 10 enemy spears. His men fell one by one around him until he stood alone with multiple wounds all over his body. He continued the fight at close quarters, with swords and any other weapons he could use. He grabbed hold of 2 soldiers and easily dispatched them, so many others didn't dare take another step forward. Dian Wei then charged forward with his remaining strength, glaring and swearing at the few men he was able to kill. His assault relented until he eventually collapsed, but his dirtied looks and harsh words continued till they could no more. Only after confirming that Dian Wei had passed did his enemies come forward to decapitate him. His head was passed around for all to see, and many of them went to the headless body to look at it. Following this, Cao Cao had safely retreated to Wuyin County, and he broke down in tears when he heard of Dian Wei's fate. He had his men retrieve Dian's body, then attended the funeral at Xingyi County. From this point on, whenever Cao Cao passed by Dian Wei's grave, he stopped to pay respects and mourn him. He missed him so much that he promoted his son Dian Man to a major and kept him close by. In autumn of 197, Cao Cao seized all of Yuan Shu's holdings north of the Hua River. When he arrived to the Runan area, Xu Chu led his militia to join him, and upon seeing the giant of a man, appointed him as commandant over the Tiger Warriors, the unit of Cao Cao's close guards. Xu Chu fought on the front lines during Cao Cao's second campaign against Jiangsu, sometime between November and December in 197. He slew many enemies, so was promoted for his achievements. He also followed Cao Cao to Guangdu, where during the battle, some conspirators plotted an assassination. Xu Chu felt uneasy during this campaign, and the plotters also feared his presence. They waited for him to return to his quarters before they entered Cao's tent with swords hidden under their clothes. Once inside, they could not contain their disbelief and confusion upon seeing Xu Chu, who had already returned. He sensed their scheme in the moment and killed them on the spot, which alerted those nearby. After this incident, Cao Cao went nowhere without Xu Chu by his side and trusted him with his life. During the Battle of Tong Pass, when the bulk of the Wei troops had already crossed the river, Cao Cao and his Tiger Warriors were the last ones to cross over and form up the rear line. Just then, Ma Chao's 10,000 horsemen caught up with them and were approaching fast. The troops rushed to board the ferry until it verged on sinking under the weight. Meanwhile, Xu Chu shielded Cao Cao by holding up a saddle with his left hand while he slashed at enemies with a sword in his right. He escorted Cao aboard while fighting off enemies who were clambering onto the boat. It remained motionless, however, as the ship's ferryman had been killed by arrows, so Xu Chu kept the saddle up, but grabbed hold of the barge pole so he could push the ferry to safety. Later, Cao agreed to meet Ma Chao and Han Sui for talks, and both sides displayed confidence. Cao brought along only Xu Chu with him, while Ma Chao planned to charge forward to capture him. He had heard Xu Chu's name before, so asked, "Where is your tiger Ma Kui?" Cao pointed to Xu Chu, who was glaring at Ma Chao, stirring fear and uncertainty within him. Ma became so afraid that he didn't dare to make his move, then both sides returned to their camps. During the decisive battle at Tong Pass, Xu Chu killed several enemies, so was later promoted to military guard of the household. this was the first time that the term military guard was used. Throughout the ranks of soldiers, many knew that Shou possessed the might of a tiger, but that he was also simple-minded, hence they nicknamed him Tiger Fool. He was known to be a cautious and serious person who didn't talk much. He was also extremely mindful of rules and regulations, as expected from a man who held responsibility for Cao Cao's safety. Shortly after Cao was enfeoffed as a vassal king, Cao Ren arrived from Jing province to meet him. When he turned up, Cao was still in his personal chambers, while Shou stood guard outside. Ren invited him into the side room for a chat, but he stated that Cao would be coming out soon, then turned his back on him. Somebody explained later that Cao Ren felt very unhappy for being treated so coldly. As a close relative of the king, and an important subject, he not only lowered his status when he asked to talk, but was also rejected. How could you treat him as such? I, Shou, am in charge of internal security. If he wanted to chat with me, we could do so in public. Why did he ask to chat with me in private? Cao Cao was impressed after he heard about Shou's overprotective approach, and so he favoured him even more and promoted him. When Cao Cao passed away in 220, Shou was so overwhelmed with grief that he vomited blood. By the time Cao Pi ascended as emperor in the same year, Shou had already earned his favour, so was promoted and put in charge of the palace guards. The original Tiger Warriors unit was disbanded, but they were all commissioned as officers. Little more than 10 of them rose to the ranks of general or marquis, while around 100 made it to commanders or colonels. 6 years later, when Cao Pi died and his son Cao Rui succeeded him, Shou was further promoted and granted a marquisate of over 700 households. He passed away in the year 230 and was posthumously titled Marquis Zhuang, the robust marquis.